Good.
Right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Aramaic Academy of Emerging Cyber Risks and Crisis Management. Today, we will be discussing cyber risk management and mitigation and current trends in crisis management. I think this topic is extremely timely because of the ongoing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're all aware of it. Schools remain closed. We are being encouraged to work from home if possible. And this, of course, has resulted in a substantial threat increase because we are all much more dependent on technology and removed from certain central processes that provided us security. So we will need to understand better what risks we need to be aware of and how companies can manage this risk. It's also important to note, I think, that remote investigation capabilities will have to increase. So to discuss these issues this morning, we're extremely fortunate to be joined by our three panelists from Control Risks. We are joined by Sean Flint, who is a member of the Control Risks Cyber Risk Advisory Team, and whose key responsibility is to provide advice and information to our clients, or rather their clients, in order to help protect them and defend themselves against cyber threats. We are also joined by Luke Faradell, who is an Associate Director in Control Risks Compliance, Forensics, and Intelligence Practice, and who has over 15 years experience working in UK intelligence. And James Leith, who is a Crisis Management Consultant within Control Risks Crisis and Security Consulting Department for Europe. James works with clients to develop and deliver training to enhance efficiency and effectiveness of crisis management teams. So at this stage, I'll hand over to James, who will take it away. Thank you very much.
In 1988, Robert Morris was working in the NSA when they were made aware of a worm that was paralyzing every single computer that was connected to the internet at the time. Pretty shortly into the investigation, one of the investigators came in and said, we've got the name of the person who created the worm. His name is Robert Morris. And Robert Morris said, that's my son. Robert Morris's son went on to be a very successful businessman and MIT professor. He was also prosecuted for creating the Morris worm. But Robert Morris, his father, had 3 golden rules for computer security. And those are, number 1, do not own a computer. Number 2, do not power it on. And number 3, do not use it. And seeing as those 3 rules cannot be applied, we need to have something different, and we need to understand the risks and understand how we're going to mitigate those. So that's the thinking behind today's session. So Sean is going to give us an introduction to the risks and threats. Then Luke's going to do a deep dive into a complex and sophisticated type of attack, and then we'll wrap up with some crisis management. Before we do that, I think we can do a little poll. We've got 3 questions coming up. So question number 1, this is audience participation. Has your company been attacked by cyber criminals? Please select one, and your options are no, yes at least once, yes many times, and option number 4, I don't know. So if you would please click on those, select on that. If you've got the ability to do so, please do that. And part of the thinking behind this poll, there was an American senator who once said that there are only 2 types of organizations: those that have been hacked by the Chinese and know about it, and those that have been hacked by the Chinese and don't know about it. So that's question number 1. I hope everybody's answered that one. Let's go. And we got some stats in. The stats are no, yes at least once, yes many times, no one. Oh, there we go. 24% I don't know. And a lot of the big challenge is knowing whether or not you have been attacked. 12% yes many times. Everybody is a target, and if you're working for a major multinational, you are a target. There is an opportunity. There was an article in the. Let's go on to the next question. What cyber risks are you concerned about? We're going to be touching on some of these today. So please select all that apply: malware, ransomware, phishing attacks, or something else. If you've got something else that you're thinking about, then please do write that in the chat bar. But what are the risks what are the cyber risks that you're concerned about? Malware, ransomware, phishing attacks, or other? There was certainly interesting article in the paper this morning talking about the foiling of attacks into the recent Olympic Games, and really just that opportunity to embarrass organizations using cyber attacks during prestigious events that any sort of attack, the gangs are out there and they're attacking and they're gaining prestige from these kind of attacks. Let's see what the poll is. What have we got? 92% malware, 88% ransomware, 96% phishing attacks, 24% other. I don't think my maths leads that up to 100, but it just means that those are the things that everyone's concerned about. We're all concerned about malware, all concerned about phishing attacks. We're also concerned about ransomware. Good. I think we've got a final question. How prepared are you for a cyber attack or a crisis or a cyber crisis? How prepared do you feel for that cyber attack? If that was to happen right away, how would you feel that you or your company would respond? So number one, not at all. Number two, somewhat, or number three, very prepared. Organizers and panelists don't vote. So, and this is where we're talking about the difference between reaction and response. It's that feeling between knowing that if a cyber attack was to happen today, you would know what to do. You'd know what that immediate action would be. You'd know what to do, or you wouldn't. Not at all, 0. Somewhat, 74%, and very prepared, 26%. So some good audience, and I think you're going to find that what we're going to be talking about today, and the deep dive interesting. Before we go on to the deep dive, we're just going to look at some of the attack trends and kind of risks that are out there, and I'm going to hand over to Sean Flint. Let's get that over to you, Sean.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, James. So in order to set the scene before we talk about attack trends, we're going to talk about some of the compliance trends we've seen, and obviously talk about our favorite topic. We've all talked about it in great detail, COVID-19. So COVID-19 has been, obviously, as we all know, been a huge problem that nation states across the world are trying to handle. One of the approaches that has been taken is to look at technology as a solution or as a kind of a silver bullet to solve this problem, and in particular, things like contact tracing. So the theory is fairly sound. If you can track who's come into contact with who, you can understand where the infection traveled from and who has it, etc. However, it introduces a few concerns that need to be addressed, which is obviously the privacy aspect. Do you want everyone in your country to always know where everyone is at the time, for example? There's the element of mandatory tracking. Within many countries, the idea of being pervasively tracked wherever you are is quite an unpleasant one. And then also there's the concern of the data actually then being used for other reasons. So you have this very large data set which tracks everyone's movements, and then actually taking that data set and using it for a different purpose, such as law enforcement. So we've seen globally different approaches to handling this. And they fall into two major camps, which is either a centralized model, where a central authority within a nation state owns the application, they own the infrastructure, and they maintain all the information that is gathered by these applications. And the secondary model is using a decentralized approach, which has been implemented by both Apple and Google within their mobile devices. A trend that we've seen is actually that many countries are trying the centralized model first, and then coming into problems with either user acceptance, i.e. people aren't downloading the app and refusing to use it, or actually falling afoul of their own local legislation around data privacy and data protection. And then actually adjusting to the Apple and Google approach. And actually, we've seen this in the UK with the NHS England app. The initial trial was a centralized model, and after realizing that actually it was not compliant with legislation such as GDPR, that was scrapped, and then the decentralized model that is now available was produced instead. But this is not a universal truth. So actually, it's driven by cultural and local differences. So, for example, as I said, in Europe, in North America, for example, there is this concern about being tracked, and there is this concern about privacy, which is not prevented, but has definitely slowed the adoption of these kind of apps and made a greater challenge for the nation, to actually implement these. Whereas, for example, in China, the Chinese government explicitly exempts themselves from any of the data protection legislation when it comes to collecting data for this purpose. So they can collect data and they can use that for contact tracing without any concerns or problems. countries. So, for example, Singapore, actually, one of the concerns globally about contact tracing is that it relies on people having smartphones. And actually, the highest risk group of COVID, the elderly, for example, is also the least likely to own a smartphone in the first place. So a few nations now, so Singapore and South Korea, have both actually started manufacturing and distributing token. For example, in South Korea, it's a bracelet that you have to wear. In Singapore, it's a small device that you carry with you. The idea here is obviously then you don't need a smartphone. Anyone can be enrolled in the system. But then that adds the additional concern about the mandatory tracking. So if we move, so we've covered this, and this is covering the entire world. So if we just look at, for example, the Middle East and Africa, they're both of these regions are having various apps and various solutions for this developed. But actually, we found them to be quite opaque about how they're going to handle data privacy. So you can just see across the world, there's a mixture of approaches and a mixture of recognition towards the concern about data privacy. And this just links back to the whole overall compliance issue. How do we maintain compliance with our local data protection legislation when actually, while still maintaining the healthcare outcomes that we're looking for? So look, if we can just move on to the next slide. So having just framed the context around the push towards things like contact tracing, it'd be good to talk about what kind of trends around cyber attacks that we're seeing. So the information here is from our cyber threat intelligence team. And if we look at the graph on the top left, the bar chart there, we can see that actually the unique campaigns that use COVID as a lure or as a main driver for their attack that we've seen since the beginning of the year has just continuously increased. And what I mean by using COVID as a lure is, for example, pretending to be an email from a track and trace organization, for example, and saying, you've been exposed to COVID, please click on this link, as an example. So by using people's uncertainty, doubt, and concern about COVID, more and more organizations are using that as an attack vector. If we then draw attention to the bar chart on the right-hand side, actually largely matching what was said in some of the polls, so that by quite a clear margin, the main attack vector we're still seeing being used is phishing, spear phishing. And this is again using quite often COVID or related things as a lure. So for example, pretending to be the World Health Organization or pretends to be different local organizations to encourage people to click on those links. And actually the fact that we're working from home increases this problem, because if you receive an email, you can't just turn to a colleague and say, oh, does this look strange to you? And that's why, well, it's one of the reasons why phishing and spear phishing is so applicable. We draw attention to the pie chart on the bottom left. We're still seeing the majority of attacks that we can attribute within cyber threat intelligence are being driven by cyber criminals, making it very clear that actually profit is the motive as a general rule. Yes, there is still a very large amount of sort of nation state attacks, etc. Of course, attribution is difficult, so it may be hard to get an exact number in this area, but the majority of the work we're seeing is criminal related. And finally, just looking at the map, you can see that the concentration of these attacks mirrors what's been expected and mirrors what's been seen for most years that we've looked into this. Okay.
Great, thanks, Sean. So hi everyone, I'm Luke. I work in the digital forensics and incident response team within Control Risks. What I wanted to do today is to give you an idea of some of the cases we've worked on since sort of March time this year, and try and put it into context, like what does it actually look like for both the victim and also the hacker in the situation. So these are some of the cases that we've worked against or worked on. So we've had sort of enterprise equipment in that shift from office environment to home. Lots of equipment went to home environments, and we saw lots of misconfigurations, things exposed that shouldn't have been, that were otherwise behind enterprise level sort of firewalls, and exposed these organizations. Other things we've seen are huge sort of that chain phishing, those campaigns Sean spoke about, using that sort of COVID-19 themed, but eventually dropping sort of a CAC bot and doppelpaymer ransomware. We saw lots of RDP access, huge trends, not going away. Companies that have sort of left their devices in remote access mode within the office and are allowing people to remote in. a lot of those aren't sort of locked down as they should be and are still being targeted. Lots of web server compromises through applications, third-party application, bolt-on plugins. There's been a few sort of vulnerabilities disclosed, and we've seen those quickly picked up by crime groups and used. And other things we've seen are a lot of website defacements, lots of political kind of campaigns, taking over other websites and sort of running on those. So really interesting. So I just want to run through a typical timeline of an attack. It always starts with external reconnaissance. Initially, the hacker has to pick their target and then, craft the payload and then deploy that, but that's all done externally to the network. Then they'll gain a foothold in the network, however that be through phishing, RDP access, or a vulnerability. Then they'll look to elevate privileges and then identify where they are, where they're landed in that network. It's kind of like, I tried to explain this to my uncle. It's like, you're a mole and you don't know where you are and you're sort of feeling around in the dark effectively. So where have you landed within this network? And then you do a scan to identify your high value targets of that network. And then once you've identified, really good central points within the network, like the domain controllers or the exchange servers, you'll then look to move to those with those elevated credentials that you've obtained. And then once you get there, you'll be looking to, once you've mapped the network, you've got to a really central point in the network, then you'll look to disable the protections that the organization's put in place. Then exfiltrate a data set that they often use as leverage to receive a payment, and then deploy a ransomware effectively on that network using the scan results. So that's kind of a broad overview of the typical timeline of attack that we often work against. So what I wanted to do is run through two of the most common attack vectors that we've seen this year, one being phishing and one being RDP, and show you what that actually looks like. Because I've been to a lot of these talks myself and people talk about them, but you never actually see the nuts and bolts, what the attacker sees and what the victim sees. So I'm going to go through that now. So this is the completely fictional scenario that we've made up involving some chicken shops, but effectively we've got a scenario here where this fictional chicken shop Pando's wants to steal the secret recipe from Nando's chicken, and the ultimate game of this exercise is to obtain a reverse shell, or like a command line interface within Nan's chicken. So you've got Pando's and then you've got Nan's chicken. So Pando's want to get access to Nan's chicken internally. So what they do is they hire someone to do this for them, and they start looking around and trying to identify how they get in. Now, Pando's do some reconnaissance activity, and Nan's chicken is completely locked down. They've got a really good infrastructure in place. They can't get in there. They can't steal that secret recipe. But what they notice is that their main kind of contractor or supplier is Dave the Farmer, and Dave the Farmer is doesn't have as locked down infrastructure as Nan's chicken. So this is what we call a supply chain attack. So you attack the supply chain in order to leverage that access and then bounce into your actual primary target of this attack. So we do some external reconnaissance initially as the hackers. So we do things like looking on their websites, do some company's house record checks, going on social media, going on LinkedIn, and we kind of craft together as much information about our victim as possible. So here we've got a company's house records, and we can see, we kind of piece together some clues or some kind of really useful information that we can leverage to craft a payload that the recipient is more likely to interact with. So so in this instance, a confirmation statement is overdue. So you could potentially, the victim might know this information and be expecting an email. Therefore, you can craft one, deliver it, and they're more likely to open it and unfortunately hack themselves effectively. So what do we do? In this instance, we go on the website for Dave the chicken farmer, and we identify that on there he's got a lovely website, but he's got a phone number and an email address. And we use this to then send an email to Dave, and we get a reply. And we effectively say, can we use your chickens? And then Dave says, no, sorry, I'm already supplying to Nan's Chicken. And what we do is we check the headers that we've received a reply from, and we identify that he's using the Gmail platform. So what we want to do then is effectively trick Dave into entering his credentials into our captive portal that we're going to set up, and steal his email and password. And then we're going to use that access to his email account to then craft a payload that we're going to send from Dave to Nan's Chicken. So there's already a line of communication there between Dave and Nan's Chicken, and we're going to hopefully intercept that, use it, and then own the Nan's Chicken network. So what we do is we craft another sort of spear phishing targeted email here with a link in it. Please read this secret document someone sent to me. And then what we do is, in the back end, I'll show you how this works, but attackers effectively clone a website. So in this instance, they'll clone the Google login page, and the link will point to our fake Google web login page. And then when Dave clicks that link, it will go to Google, this fake login page. He'll think he's at his own, type in his credentials, hit go, and then what it will do is our script will bounce him onto Google, but what it will do is it will pass us the username and password. So this is what it looks like from a victim point of view. So you'll see up here, I'll paste the bit.ly link. Then when I hit go, it will change to the IP address. That's one of the signs to look out for. Then this is the, there you go. So it changes. Then what happens is put in email address and then password, and we hit sign in. And what that does is it just pushes them onto the regular Google account, but so it's bounced back there. So what happens in the back end is we've got this cloned website stood up, and as soon as they connect, we get their IP address and date and time. And then once they've hit submit with their user credentials, we'll see those pop up, and we'll have stolen them, unbeknown to the victim. So there you go, Dave Chicken, and password is Peri Peri. So it's as simple as that. People fall in victim to this, unfortunately, every day. We work on a lot of these cases. You can see how it's very easy to fall victim to. So what we then do is we want to craft a payload. So we've now got control of Dave's email account. And what we want to do with that is effectively use it to then email Nan's Chicken, and then they're expecting emails from Dave all the time. And we craft a payload within that, and then they'll hopefully open it, and then as the attacker, we'll get access into Nan's Chicken. One of the tools we use for this is a tool called Metasploit. Metasploit is a framework for attackers. Lots of other attack tools are built on top of Metasploit. It's effectively a command line interface, and you can craft payloads, deliver payloads, and also once a piece of malware is executed at the endpoint, it will beacon back to us, and we set up what's called a listener. So we're basically waiting for the victim to click that link, and then it kind of reaches out to our infrastructure and lets us interact with their domain remotely. So just to recap, this is so there's the hacker on the left there. We've spearphished Dave. Dave's entered his credentials into number 2 there, our fake captive portal. We've then taken Dave's email, which is point 3. We've crafted a payload, and using that trusted relationship between Dave and Nan's Chicken. And then Nan's going to open that email that we send. In there is a document, in this case, an Excel document. Once they open that, it reaches out to our attack infrastructure, downloads the malware in the background and runs it on that machine. That's point 5, and then I've missed 6. Oh no, 6 is the the malware, retrieving the malware. Then point 7 is getting that reverse shell, or that kind of connection, directly into our victim. And it's the reason it's called a reverse shell is it comes to us. We don't have to go to it. It's really cool. It kind of reaches out back to us and says, hey, we've got access. It's really effective. What can we do with this access? We can read, edit documents, upload, download files. We can upload binaries like executables and run those on the remote system. We can conduct scanning activity in that network. We can clear our tracks. We can, erase event logs. Really kind of good anti-forensics hacking techniques. We can search for specific files. So we've seen attackers conducting like keyword searches, such as like finance, accounts, bank details. We've seen a lot of that. We can even, that scary stuff like opening people's webcams and then also taking screenshots. Sometimes what we've often seen is in attacks, the initial attacker will gain access to a network, capture screenshots, gather some information together, and then actually sell that on the dark web, sell that access to other hackers who then come in and then exploit it, maybe deploy ransomware, and then leverage that for money. They often take screenshots to kind of prove they've got access, which is really cool. This is what the payload essentially looks like. So it's that classic macro, click the macro, everyone does it, and then it basically runs the scripts behind the document. And then in this instance, what it does is it creates persistence on that device, so that every time it logs in, someone logs into that, it will reach out and connect back to us, so they can turn it off, turn it back on again. They don't need to keep clicking this enable macros. It was just sort of persistent on the operating system, and it will reach back to us and say, yep, we've got another connection. So this is what the payload will look like to Dave. And in our kind of scenario, Dave, unfortunately, Nan's click the link. So this is what it looks like. So we set up, this is the attacker's infrastructure here. So in this case, we're setting up a listener. So we're waiting for that connection from Nan's Chicken. So the email's gone out to Nan's Chicken, and we're waiting. So we set the listener host is our own host we're listening on. We set a customized port that we're expecting the payload to beacon back to, and then we exploit it. And then you'll see down here, we get an immediate connection because they've already clicked it and it's running on their system. And then what we can do here is connect to the session. So we've got a session on that desktop. That means we've got a connection. We can see that user account's access. And then we've got what they call interpreter shell. So we can start to run commands on that remote system. So this is exactly what the hacker would see. We can traverse the file system here. So we're just kind of, as you would on a local system using the command line, we're just running it remotely. So we're running through, we're getting a directory readout of the system there. We're going to the users folder. Now we're going to jump on to that user's desktop. And then we're going to have a look at what's on that desktop. And we can see there's a recipe, and we can read that recipe document here. So then we hit go, and it will read it back to us. So garlic, chili, salt, vinegar. So effectively what we can do with this access now is we can download that file, we can delete it on their system, we can deploy other tools, we can deploy ransomware with this access, or we can sell access. So it's really quite powerful, all from a kind of command line shell. It's pretty cool. And as the victim of this information, of this attack, you wouldn't see any of this activity. This goes on completely behind the scenes. You're running, you're running code directly to the operating system. There'll be no pop-ups or anything on the window. Once they've executed that macro, you've got access to that device. And it's only at the point that they kind of deploy ransomware that they get that scary pop-up message on their device that says, you need to pay us money to get access to your data again. So this is another attack that we've seen a lot of. This is RDP brute forcing, where effectively you've got remote desktop protocol running on a system, and you basically hammer it with a huge list of passwords and username combinations, and you're just kind of trying to brute force and crack that password and get in. What we've seen is attackers using open source infrastructure controls and scanning tools. So in this instance, we've got a screenshot here of the login page. So if you've got RDP open and accessible to the internet, anyone can connect to your system. And by connect, they can get to the initial page where you log into that system. And other profiles that have logged into that system are displayed. So some cases they're already signed in, some cases they're kind of waiting to sign in. And what you can do is you can scrape information from this login page to kind of craft a customized password kind of tool. So you want to get a word list effectively of you know, password 123 and all these kind of, you know, typical passwords that unfortunately people still use. In this case, we're using a tool called Mentalist, and you can put in things like the English dictionary, the names that you've scraped off this login page, maybe the company name. You can put in football teams. You can put in, you know, slang, expletives. Then you can add things like years and, you know, date of births, uppercase, lowercase, special characters, and you hit go, and this tool Mentalist will create a list. So it will take like all those things and add, you know, years and punctuation and special characters to it, and we'll end up with a huge list of words. Then we basically fire it at that system in the hope of one of those matching. You only need one to match. And on that remote system that the hackers are attacking, we'll often see this in the event logs once we've turned up to an incident. We'll initially identify, we'll get a case in, we'll do our own reconnaissance externally and identify, you know, ports that are open or applications that are running on those networks. Often we'll identify, you know, RDP as a potential attack vector. Then when we get the information from the victim and we start doing analysis, this is what we'll find. We'll find huge amounts of audit failures on that system, where the hacker's been basically blasting it with incorrect username and password combinations, and then they will eventually get the right combination and then unlock that system and gain access to the network. So this is what we'll see. You know, that these systems are screaming out for help. They're really kind of being hammered. There'll be sometimes noticeable impact on that system, but they often go, you know, sort of, you know, they don't flag, people don't flag it to their IT departments, and then eventually they get unfortunately compromised. And then I wanted to show you briefly what exfiltration of data looks like. So once the attackers are in, there's lots of different tools they can use to steal the data. And effectively what we get is, you know, these kind of, when we look at the perimeter login on the firewalls or on some of the servers, we see this huge spike in usually out of hours, you know, data traffic leaving the networks. So we'll see, you know, down here on the bottom chart, we'll see those sort of 5 peaks. That's your typical Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Then a, you know, downtime for the weekend. And then when we see the attack, unfortunately, we see a huge exfiltration of data on the Tuesday. Bang, you know, just hits max bandwidth. So it's just the hackers, effectively what they do is they gather up all the information they want to exfiltrate. They compress it into one large archive, usually using something like a zip tool, and then they'll execute it or exfiltrate it in one big stream of data. So you'll see gigabytes just leaving the network all at once. So that's basically a quick run through of a supply chain phishing attack leading to, you know, a reverse shell in a company. Also, we've talked through RDP access through brute forcing, and then also what exfiltration of data actually looks like from inside a network. So I'll hand back over to Sean.
Okay, great. Thank you, Luke. So what I'll be doing now is we'll talk through just some of the key areas we want to discuss about reducing cyber risk and managing that whilst in a remote environment. Then I'll hand over to James, who will talk about some of the more intricacies about crisis management. So the first thing I want to talk about here is really awareness. So as I said, we've got 3 areas. As we discussed on our trend slide, we're still seeing that the majority of attacks are being carried out by using phishing or spear phishing. And this is where awareness really comes into play, because your users are obviously faced with these threats on a regular basis. They are being, targeted by malicious actors, and by preparing them with the suitable training to make them aware of, what is phishing, for example. What is it? What does it look like? How do I identify it? And also, how do I report it? And how do I make other people aware of it if I see it? If you carry out this kind of training, users are more likely to not click on those links. One of the problems we have, or one of the challenges we have with the remote working environment that a lot of us are in now, is it removes that kind of casual confirmation you can have with someone around you. So if you're in the office and you see something that looks a bit suspicious or doesn't look right, you can just raise your voice in the office and say, hey guys, what does this look like? This looks like a phishing email to me. But if someone's working from home, they are both physically and often increasingly mentally isolated. They're stuck at home, they're working by themselves, and they can't necessarily have that confirmation, because pick up the phone to someone to say, oh, is this email a phishing email, might be seen as too excessive for some people. So that they're more likely to either do nothing and ignore it, which is not ideal, or even worse, click on the email. Once you've carried out that kind of training, there's also a need to test it. So this is where phishing simulations really come in. And the reason why this is useful is firstly putting the training into practice. So you've taught your users how to identify it and how to deal with phishing. Now let's see if that training has actually bedded in and is actually truly understood. The results you get from this will show those users in the organization that actually require additional training or additional focus, and just have maybe some further attention paid to. So for example, what we do with a lot of our clients, if users are repeatedly failing these kind of phishing simulations, we identify that user or that role, if it's more endemic than that, as someone who needs additional training. So maybe the particular role they're in requires them to open attachments a lot. For example, what we see with some of our clients, people who work within finance, receiving things like invoices, for example, their job role means they have to open attachments. So they're more likely to open an email that may be suspicious simply because they are opening more emails with attachments. So some of the advice around don't open attachments doesn't work for them because of their job role. And so then we can talk about maybe tailoring the approach to how they're trained to help them identify which of those emails that they receive with attachments are applicable and which ones are actually phishing attempts. There's also need to communicate on a regular basis. So obviously, a lot of training in organizations is done on a sort of once a year, maybe twice a year basis. And that's quite a long time to forget these kind of things. So one thing we're also key to encourage is just regular communications. For example, many organizations use Yammer for internal communication, just to push out some communications from security saying, hey, by the way, here's some key things about phishing and other security topics, just to keep those kind of things in people's minds. The next 2 aspects are more from a technical angle. So if we talk about the corporate world, so our corporate infrastructure, starting actually from the bottom up, audit and logging are really, really key, because with a suitable logging and alerting system, you can obviously identify incidents or compromise much faster. So for example, if we refer back to one of Luke's slides, we saw how when an attacker was trying to brute force RDP, you could see there was tons and tons of alerts and logs being produced, but in that organization, there was no one paying attention to it. So audit and logging with appropriate infrastructure and teams in place to actually observe those logs and action that information is really key, because you can log everything, but if no one looks at those logs, they're useless effectively for preventing an incident or at least catching it in its early days. But also, unfortunately, should an incident occur, having complete logs can help you understand how it occurred and prevent it from happening again. Gateway filtering is another thing that's important, and working with clients that I've spoken to recently, they all have gateway filtering, i.e. stopping users from accessing certain websites or certain activities online. They have that in place when they're working in the office, but actually a blind spot that we've seen repeatedly is that when people are working from outside the office, that's not in place. So one of my clients recently, we were auditing, they said, yes, we have gateway filtering in place. Users can't access file share websites like Dropbox, for example, to upload files. But actually it was discovered upon further analysis that only worked if you're in one of their factories or one of their offices. So when everyone's working from home, you could access any website, and actually more importantly, a user could either inadvertently or potentially upload important information and confidential documentation to wherever they wanted because there was nothing in place. So making sure that's in place in a way that actually covers users of working from home is really key. Thirdly is multi-factor authentication. The advice here varies. My personal advice is that it should be deployed on every system that it can be deployed on. The pushback we normally get on that is, well, yes, but it's very disruptive to have to, repeatedly authenticate with, a token every time I want to use a certain system. My approach for that and my recommendation there would be to actually deploy things like single sign-on. A combination of single sign-on with multi-factor makes it much harder for an attacker. So to again refer to Luke's example, in that scenario where we managed to get the email and password for Dave the chicken farmer, had he had two-factor authentication, that attack wouldn't have been successful in the way it was carried out because yes, we had his password and his email address, but we didn't have his software token or whichever form of second-factor authentication he was using. And finally, segregating your services and your system. So for example, if you have a system that only needs to be accessed internally, don't open it to the internet. Very, very simple in that regard. Segregate things to only be accessible from those people and services that need them, just to ensure that if an attacker is to gain access, it's harder for them to move around the organization. The final element I want to talk about is about working from home and the home environment. So in this situation, you've got a lot of people who are now obviously working from home. They will have been bringing corporate devices home and using them. But actually, because of the very sudden shift to work from home that we've seen, quite a few organizations weren't equipped for this, and actually users are using their personal devices to connect back into the organization simply because there wasn't the hardware available when they needed it. So key things to think of here is making sure the devices are appropriately managed. So having endpoint management solutions, both for corporate devices and actually if you are allowing users to use their own personal devices, additional solutions to manage those as well. So to ensure things like security updates are applied, to ensure that there's proper endpoint detection. So, detecting malware and such as that on those devices is really, really key because we've seen a lot of clients in recent months actually where they've had they've basically had a panic. They've had to move to work from home. Their users back in the office were using desktops. There was no laptops available. So they're letting people use their personal devices and actually not checking if those have antivirus on them, checking if they're compromised in any way. And so actually making sure that kind of endpoint management is in place is really key. Using VPN, so virtual private networks, depends on your infrastructure. For example, if you're using exclusively Office 365, for example, which is accessible over the web, a VPN isn't necessary. But actually, if you have a service that is, for example, on-premise, and a key example of this is accounting servers. These are often accessed via RDP when you're in the office, which is fine. But the solution has often been, unfortunately, to open those out to the internet so that when people work from home, they can RDP back into the head office and access an accounting server. This introduces a whole element of risk that actually Luke just covered, which is you now have your RDP accessible to the internet. A better solution in that situation would be to use a VPN to connect back to the office and then connect with RDP to the financial server. The final point here is changing how IT teams work a little bit here, because users are working from home, and so devices that would normally be considered completely out of scope actually should need attention from IT. An example here is home networking. So most people use the router provided to them by their ISP. You sign up for whichever network, you receive a router as part of it, and you use that without changing any settings. If you have problems with that, there may be a need for IT teams that normally would say, no, it's a personal device, we don't touch it, to actually help out, because otherwise users won't be able to work remotely from home. That's all from me.
Thank you, Sean. If you've got any questions, please do type them into the chat bar, and we'll answer those at the end. If you've got any questions for myself, Sean or Luke, do type them in. We're here to answer any questions that you have on this complex subject. And in terms of crisis management, I mean, what's very clear about the cyber risk and cyber crisis management is that certainly within control risks, when we're looking at crisis risks, when we're looking at risks to an organization, we're often looking at two things. And one of those things is the impact, is the likelihood of that thing happening, and the second thing is the impact. So it's the likelihood versus the impact. And a lot of the work that we do when we're looking at impact and likelihood is we're looking at high impact, low likelihood situations. So kidnap, terrorism. What's very clear about cyber is that cyber sits up at the high impact, high likelihood state, right up in the red, and that's why people are investing in it. That's why people are taking it seriously. That said, a lot of what needs to be done in terms of your organization's crisis management remains the same in terms of having this ability to combine weak signal detection with a rapid response mechanism, that difference between reacting and responding. And because a cyber crisis, whilst it's originating within the cyber field, it's affecting every part of the business as a normal major crisis would. It's affecting you operationally, reputationally, legally, and financially. So bringing that crisis management team to bear on the situation is your solution to this and many other crisis situations. And if we look at that sort of preparation, the three key areas to help to focus on: leadership, people, and intelligence. So that on the leadership side, how can people become more informed as leaders in order to make better decisions? And critically, how do people decide when it's a crisis or not? Because sometimes it's very obvious when there's a crisis situation. You receive some information and you know you've got a crisis. A lot of the time, you're not. It's very clear that there's not a crisis. But for a lot of organizations, when something happens, it's not clear if it's a crisis or not. What do you do in that situation? And that's where applying the principle of prudent internal overreaction really helps. And that's what we advise within our organizations. If you're not sure what to do, make the call. This is probably nothing, which is why I'm calling you. The advice from the head of FEMA after Hurricane Katrina, not a cyber attack, but a different type of crisis, was go big early. It's much easier to stand your resources up and then stand them down again than it is to wait too late. And traditionally, it's often been difficult within IT departments. Like a lot of organizations prefer to fix the situation before informing everybody that a situation has taken place, rather than getting the information out to get people prepared and thinking and getting that response mechanism happening and understanding that that's the best shield against this kind of attack. On your people side, it's bringing in the people. What is it that we can do? What skills? Sean's been talking about that on the previous slide. What are the things that we can do to improve our employees' resilience to any situation? What are the things that we can do to protect our organization? A resilient organization is made up of resilient individuals. So the education and training is what's going to make the difference. And then on the intelligence side, and I'd say my number one rule of crisis management is the application of expertise to the situation as quickly as possible. And either you've got that expertise yourself, you've got it within your organization, or you reach out externally to your specialist advisors, and they can, again, forming part of this response mechanism, bringing them in early rather than waiting until it's too late. And this sort of training ability is what makes the difference in terms of turning that reaction into a capable response. So taking people through, what's your worst case scenario, ransomware, malware, what does that look like? Running an exercise to take away the uncertain elements of it, because when people look at a crisis, they're often looking at it as a chaotic and uncertain situation. The reality is that in a crisis, there are completely predictable elements, and those completely predictable elements you can prepare for and train for in order to give you bandwidth for the unpredictable elements that are going to come your way. I think we've got one more slide. Just a final thought, really, just on developing resilience and sort of moving out really from cyber, but cyber is very much part of this, any type of crisis situation. What we're seeing, if you look at enterprise risk management, that sort of business resilience and the focus on business resilience, what we're seeing with COVID-19 is that resilience needs to be spread out, and it needs to be global. What are the things globally that can affect our organization? So not necessarily just the things directly affecting our organizations, but those things globally. And I'd say what I've been pleased to see in terms of crisis management and response is that compassionate leadership, compassionate crisis leadership, putting people at the heart of any sort of crisis response. And it's developing that personal resilience and supporting employees to develop their personal resilience to uncertainty, to crisis situations. They're going to happen, and we need to be prepared for them. And those are the three that we can work on, and there's the sweet spot right in the middle where we've developed our business resilience. We've anticipated that we're working together on a global resilience, but crucially, we're also working on our personal resilience so that we can absolutely be part of the solution and do what we need to do when a crisis strikes. And in terms of good examples of that, there was one organization that I was talking to in terms of COVID response, and they had an office in Paris, and because of the disturbances in Paris, they'd implemented two things. Those two things were, number one, a work from home policy, and number two, the crisis management team were meeting once a week, and that meant that when COVID hit, those sort of two critical mechanisms were already in place, so they were able to respond to the situation rather than react. And that's what we want to see in cyber response, is a cyber response and not a cyber reaction. Good. Let's see. Have we got any questions in?
Excellent.
Alex? I think that covered. Don't go back to normal. Go back to better. Any questions, Alex?
Yeah. Thanks very much for that, James. We've had a number of questions in. One of the first ones I want to ask relates to one of the polls that you conducted at the beginning. Was how many people said they've been the victim of attack, or how many didn't know? And I know that often there's a significant lag time between an attack and finding out that you've actually been attacked. So in the first place, is it usual for there to be a long stretch of time for you to not know about it right away, but only find out, say, weeks or months later? And in that case, how does your crisis management swing into operation in that respect?
Well, before I bring in the specialist, there's a good story on that, and that was Brian Shields. Brian Shields was head of security for a firm called Nortel Networks. He was head of security in the UK. Nortel Networks at one point was the darling of the Toronto Stock Exchange, and employed thousands of people. Brian Shields noticed that some of the senior executives have been downloading information, excessive amounts of data. So I went to see them and asked them why they were doing it, and they said they weren't. So Brian then dug down into that and found out that people have been downloading significant amounts of data going back years, and going back years up to and including a point where the company had engaged in a joint venture with a Chinese company. At that, going back to 2000, when Nortel Networks had started to lose out on commercial tenders, often on pricing, to a relatively unknown company at the time called Huawei. Nortel Networks no longer exists. It filed for bankruptcy in 2009. And is that a coincidence or not? You decide. But let's bring in, so that sort of time scale of years going back, hoovering up sensitive data. Again, that sort of weak signal detection. When Luke showed that little graph of the amount of data heading out of your company door, that's the best way to find out. Luke?
Yeah. So when we do the digital forensics, we want to basically get there as quick as possible, because it depends on the logging that's available. So the point of compromise, the initial compromise, or the attack that leads up to the compromise, it depends on the vector and what logging is enabled. So default RDP attack, the security event logs usually record about 25 megabytes, I think, of data, and that's roughly, if someone's hitting an RDP as much as we saw in that demonstration, you're talking maybe an hour of logs that system's going to capture. And what we've seen a trend for is the attackers, once they've gained access, they'll then start hitting that system from another system to overwrite the successful login. So basically kind of cover up the point that they actually got access to the network. So then it depends on what they want to do with that access, because if they do their initial reconnaissance, they can gain access and be very quiet in that network and sort of just live there and identify key assets, identify the value of their access, and then if they want to go and sell that, if that period is longer than a couple of weeks, logs start to age off, and when it comes to doing the forensics, it gets really tricky, if I'm honest. You rely on these obscure logs or application logs that you never really knew were there, and you kind of have to dig a bit deeper. But yeah, we have a 2-hour window where we have to start turning around, being engaged with the client and collecting data. So we really try and get there as quick as possible. But yeah, as soon as something's picked up, like James said, it's that response, getting straight in there and starting collecting information as quick as possible. And if you're an organization that is being attacked, you've got to start thinking about preserving that data as well. There's no sort of exact answer with that one, but
no, I appreciate that very much. Well, let's go to another question that's come in from our viewers, and this one is technology related, obviously, and I think it's something that's forefront of a lot of our minds at the moment, which is can anybody comment a little bit on cloud computing and how they see cloud computing as a risk management loss control tool for company systems and data storage, and is that as safe as is being suggested, or does it have unique threats of its own?
Who's going to come on that one? Sean, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So I'll address this from two angles. Firstly is the angle of actually using cloud computing for your infrastructure day to day. And then the second angle will be using cloud computing as your sort of disaster recovery infrastructure. So talking about it from the first angle for a moment, cloud computing, I'm personally in favor of it. It's a great resource. It allows you to be more flexible, etc. But it does. So firstly, a lot of the marketing makes it seem that it's inherently more resilient and it's inherently, highly available, etc. That's not really the case without it appropriately being configured and set up. You can find actually, yes, you have your stuff in the cloud, but actually it doesn't mean it's going to be more resilient than having it on premises, which is kind of a marketing issue there. There's also the element of actually, if it's on premise, for example, if you have your servers on premise, unless you actively make them available to the internet, they can't be accessed from outside the organization directly. Of course, someone could gain access to another server and then access that server from internal. Whereas cloud-related infrastructure is already online. It's it's inherently publicly available if it's incorrectly configured. So there's been repeated instances of organizations having, for example, AWS storage buckets, so S3 buckets full of important confidential material, publicly available. So if you know the URL for that, you can just go there and download all the files. So I think the consequences of misconfiguration are greater in the cloud. It can be very secure, it can be very resilient, it can be very agile, which is why I really am in favor of it, but it has to be properly managed. So it can be great from kind of from the risk management angle, because you can, for example, have infrastructure as code. So you can actually define how your infrastructure should be set up and how it should work. And that makes it much easier in my mind to actually audit how it's set up, and then you can actually check if that's set up in a resilient and correct way. But it's not a kind of fire and forget, make an account with Azure or whichever provider, throw some servers in there and then job's done. It's not that kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
From the second angle about using it as a disaster recovery aspect, I think that's quite positive because, as I said, it's very agile. You can create new servers and new infrastructure very quickly. So from a disaster recovery point of view, if your primary infrastructure is unavailable, actually, yes, you could very quickly stand up for replacing infrastructure in the cloud. Of course, it goes back to my previous comment about it's not inherently secure or inherently resilient. So that would need to be considered when it comes to sort of planning for that aspect.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much for that. We only have a couple of minutes left, and so we have one final question that came in. I think your examples earlier of attacks like the supply chain attack and the RDP brute force are fantastic. Beyond that, when you get to someone who's using ransomware to hold ransom some piece of information or some individual at your company, one of our members is interested to know if you could say anything about what the legality or the process of negotiating ransom payments are. Now, that's not a technical risk management issue, but I think that is part of the broader risk management process when it comes to cyber. James, I don't know if that's one that you're able to comment on at all.
Yeah, it's a sensitive area, and anybody who's paying ransomware payments is essentially funding R&D for cyber criminals. That's the challenge behind it. And what are you paying? What are you funding that ransomware with? It's with your shareholders, stakeholders' money. So the complexity of making a decision about whether or not you're going to lose all of your company's data and go out of business, or you're going to pay money to criminals. What we find is that sort of ethical dilemma, the challenges of it, the reality of it, and making that decision. Again, it's trying to make that decision at 3 o'clock in the morning with zero notice is practically impossible. You're making your life extremely difficult for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So taking that into a scenario-based desktop exercise where you bring the sort of the decision makers together, operations, finance, legal, HR, communications, and you run that scenario for them. You're under ransomware attack. What do? Having those complex ethical, moral decisions, and also gaining advice from specialists is absolutely the best way for any sort of difficult moral dilemma that you can anticipate, expecting that you're going to be able to make that kind of decision extremely quickly with the full force of reputational risk on your head is unfeasible. So buy yourself time in advance by having those conversations before you need to.
Thank you. Yes, and that's a strong endorsement for crisis management preparation and scenario planning. So that's great. Thank you. So we are in fact out of time, but I want to thank our panel today and Control Risks for what was an excellent presentation and really engaging and informative for me personally, as well as I'm sure our audience. And thank you very much for taking the time to speak to the Academy today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.